What occurs when two corrupt officers apprehend an innocent man, setting off a chain of events that forces his brother to take justice into his own hands. This is the compelling narrative of a determined black man who, after enduring years of systemic injustice, flips the script on those who exploit their authority. From a high-stakes encounter to an explosive fallout, the tale showcases justice served against those tasked with protecting the public. The day unfolded without warning. Red and blue lights erupted in Damon's rearview mirror, interrupting the gentle hum of his car engine as it rolled along a desolate road. His jaw clenched momentarily before he released a measured breath. This was no ordinary stop. It was the culmination of meticulous preparation. Damon pulled over, his hands steady on the wheel, as he guided the vehicle to a stop at the side of the road, where the stretch was barren of witnesses, the perfect stage for abuse, or for justice. The police cruiser halted behind him, and Damon adjusted his mirror to observe two officers emerging from the vehicle. Officer Paul Wright strode forward with exaggerated authority, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon in a display of dominance. His partner, Officer Daniel Moore, followed, quieter but equally culpable. Damon's heartbeat remained controlled as he pressed a discreet button beneath his radio, activating hidden cameras planted throughout the car. Every angle was covered, every word recorded. Months of strategy had led to this moment, and failure was not an option. This was for his brother, unjustly imprisoned by the same officers now approaching his window. As Paul reached the driver's side, Damon lowered the window. The sweltering heat swept into the car, carrying the faint odor of asphalt and dry grass. Paul's mirrored sunglasses reflected Damon's unwavering expression as he leaned in with a sneer. "Afternoon. You know why I stopped you?" Paul's words carried a sneering tone, laced with provocation. "No, sir. Care to explain?" Damon replied, his voice calm but unwavering, his hands visible on the steering wheel. Paul smirked. "Broken tail light. And you were driving erratically. Where are you headed in such a hurry?" Damon glanced toward his side mirror, catching Daniel's uneasy expression. He let the officer's words linger before responding evenly. "Just heading home. Didn't realize there was an issue with the tail light." Paul let out a humorless chuckle. "We'll see about that. License and registration." Without hesitation, Damon handed over the documents, his actions deliberate and composed. The scene was unfolding as anticipated. Paul's smirk widened as he inspected the papers. "Broken tail light. Erratic driving. You've got a real problem here," Paul sneered, every word crafted to provoke. Damon held his composure, glancing briefly at the officers reflected in his mirror. "With respect, officer, my taillight was fine when I left home. Perhaps it's a mistake." Paul laughed sharply, his partner echoing the sentiment with a faint chuckle. Daniel leaned lazily against the car window. "Mistaken? You think we're making this up?" Paul's tone shifted abruptly to one of command. "Step out of the car." Damon paused for a split second, a calculated act of defiance, before speaking. "Is there a reason, officer?" "I've complied with everything." Paul leaned closer, his voice dropping an octave. "Step out now, or it'll get worse for you." His hand hovered near his weapon, the implicit threat unmistakable. Damon's eyes flicked between the officers before he unclipped his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out slowly. Sunlight bathed him as he stood upright, his hands relaxed but visible. "Good boy," Paul muttered, nodding toward the hood. "Hands where I can see them. Let's keep this simple." Damon walked to the front of his car, placing his palms flat on the hot metal. His reflection stared back at him in the windshield, distorted but resolute. Paul began circling him, his presence menacing. Meanwhile, Daniel casually moved to the passenger side, opening the door without permission. "What are you doing?" Damon called out, his tone calm yet edged with defiance. "You don't get to ask questions," Paul snapped, closing the distance between them. "Keep your mouth shut, or you're going downtown. Got it?" Behind him, Daniel grinned as he rummaged through the glove compartment, scattering papers onto the ground. "What do we have here? Travel light, huh?" Damon's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his expression impassive. Every move, every word, every insult was being recorded, unbeknownst to his oppressors. "You nervous or something?" Paul's voice turned mocking. "Most people don't just sit there quiet like you. Makes me wonder." Damon tilted his head slightly. "Wonder about what, officer?" Paul stepped closer, his shadow enveloping Damon. "What you're hiding. People like you always think you're smarter than us. Running scams, pulling stunts, always up to no good. But we catch you every single time." For the briefest moment, Damon's fingers twitched against the hood, but his face betrayed nothing. "You seem to have strong opinions for someone pulling me over for a tail light." Paul's lip curled in disdain. "You think this is funny? We'll see who's laughing when we're done." Behind them, Daniel retrieved a small bag from beneath the passenger seat, a harmless item Damon had planted earlier. The officers were taking the bait. When integrity is put to the test, the cracks in authority become glaring. Daniel held up the planted bag, his voice carrying false triumph. "Bingo!" he exclaimed, shaking it for emphasis. Paul's face lit up with a smug grin as he snatched the bag. Turning to Damon, he dangled it inches from his face. "Well, well, well, look what we found. Care to explain this?" Damon's expression was unreadable as he replied, "I don't know what that is." "Oh, sure you don't," Paul sneered, shaking the bag for effect. "Funny how it's always the same excuse. Not mine. Don't know how it got there, but we've been doing this long enough to know when someone's lying." Daniel let out a chuckle, pacing around the car. "Classic. You'll deny it all the way to booking, but it won't matter. Evidence is evidence." Paul leaned in closer, his tone dripping with condescension. "Here's the thing about guys like you. You think you're untouchable, think the system works for you. But newsflash, we are the system. Out here, we decide what happens. And guess what? Nobody's coming to save you." Damon's fingers pressed against the hood for a fleeting second, his knuckles whitening. Then he steadied himself, his voice soft but cutting. "I'd be careful if I were you, officer." Paul's face twisted in mock surprise. "Careful? Are you threatening me now?" "No threat," Damon replied evenly. "Just advice." Paul's bitter laugh pierced the tension. He tossed the bag to Daniel. "Run it through the system. I bet this guy's got a record a mile long." Daniel nodded, heading back toward the cruiser, while Paul lingered, his stance casual, but his gaze sharp. "You should have kept driving," he muttered, his tone full of menace. "Now you're about to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Damon remained silent, his eyes fixed on Paul. Meanwhile, Daniel fiddled with the cruiser's computer, holding the planted evidence like a trophy. Damon's eyes briefly tracked him before locking back onto Paul, who was now uncomfortably close. "You should have just played along, kid," Paul continued, tapping Damon's shoulder mockingly. "Could have been easy." Damon's jaw tightened. "I didn't realize cooperating included having my rights violated." Paul let out a humorless chuckle. "Rights? That's cute. You think this is some courtroom drama? You don't get to pull that lawyer crap with me." Daniel's voice interrupted, crackling over the radio. "Running his name now, Paul. We'll see what pops up." Damon tilted his head slightly toward the sound, letting the silence stretch before speaking. "You're wasting your time." Paul's hand clamped onto Damon's shoulder, forcing him to face forward. "Don't turn your head unless I tell you to." Damon's voice remained calm. "You seem tense, officer. Something bothering you?" Paul's jaw tightened, his smirk faltering for a brief moment before he recovered. "What bothers me is guys like you. Think you're smarter than us. Acting calm, but inside, you're shaking, aren't you?" Damon didn't respond. Paul stepped back, circling to the trunk where Daniel had tossed Damon's belongings. He rifled through the pile carelessly, letting a water bottle roll onto the gravel. "Nice ride you've got here," Paul muttered. "A bit flashy, don't you think?" Damon tilted his head slightly. "I work hard for what I have, officer." Paul smirked. "Hard work? Or something else?" Damon's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe if you stopped profiling people and started asking real questions, you'd find the truth." Paul stood abruptly, his boots grinding against the gravel. He leaned in close, his face inches from Damon's. "Run that mouth some more, and I'll give you plenty of time to explain yourself when we haul you in." "Paul!" Daniel's voice broke the tension, tinged with confusion. "There's nothing coming up on him." Paul froze, his posture stiffening. "What?" Daniel stepped out of the cruiser, holding the radio mic loosely. "Clean record. No warrants, no priors. Nothing. Paul's face darkened as he turned back to Damon, his eyes narrowing. I don't buy it. Maybe you're just good at hiding things. Or maybe, Damon replied calmly, you're looking for something that isn't there. Paul ignored him, waving Daniel off. Keep searching. This guy's hiding something. Nobody drives a car like this and comes up squeaky clean. Daniel shrugged and returned to the car, frustration growing as his search turned frantic. Papers flew from the glove compartment, and Damon's gym bag thudded onto the asphalt. Damon's gaze flickered briefly to the mess. You're really making yourselves at home in there. Paul stalked back toward him, his boots grinding on the gravel. You keep talking like you've got the upper hand here, he growled. He leaned in again, his voice low and threatening. But let me remind you of something. There's two of us, and only one of you. Out here, nobody cares what you have to say. Damon's calm facade didn't crack. His voice dropped just slightly. You sure about that? Paul stiffened, something in Damon's tone unsettling him. He pointed a finger in Damon's face. Keep it up, smart-ass. I'm about done with this little act of yours. From behind, Daniel's voice rang out again, sharper this time. Paul! There's nothing here. I've checked everything. Paul spun around, his irritation boiling over. Then keep looking. Daniel hesitated, holding up the planted bag. We've got enough with this. Paul's tone turned sharp. I said, keep looking. Damon stood silent, but watchful, his eyes taking in every move as the officer's frustration grew. Tension crackled in the sweltering heat as Paul's temper surged, his veneer of control slipping with each passing moment. Daniel, though still aligned with his partner, was beginning to waver, his loyalty tempered by second thoughts as the situation spiraled. Damon stood silent but steadfast, watching as Paul overplayed his authority, dragging both officers further into a quagmire of their own making. Paul turned back to Damon, his anger bubbling over. This doesn't end here. You know that, right? Damon allowed a faint smirk to cross his lips. You're right, it doesn't. Before Paul could respond, a faint chirping noise broke through the oppressive silence, disrupting the rhythm of the escalating confrontation. Damon tilted his head slightly, glancing toward the trunk. The sound came again, deliberate and distinct. Paul's eyes darted to the source, suspicion flaring in his expression. What's that? Paul demanded. Damon didn't respond, letting the question hang unanswered. The officers exchanged glances, unease creeping into their expressions. Paul, Daniel ventured hesitantly. Maybe we should— Shut it! Paul snapped, cutting him off. His sharp tone betrayed his growing uncertainty as he turned back to Damon. What are you pulling here? The chirping stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the muted hum of passing cars. Damon remained perfectly still, his hands on the hood, his face impassive. The silence felt oppressive, pressing down on the officers as they stood there, unsure of their next move. Paul's hand hovered near his belt, his breathing heavier now, betraying his rising frustration. Damon watched them silently, knowing they were unraveling, their authority eroding with every impulsive decision. He could feel the heat of Paul's glare burning into him, but he didn't flinch. Paul finally broke the standoff, tossing the phone back into the trunk with a sneer. His frustration was palpable as he barked, "Turn around!" Damon didn't move immediately. "Why?" he asked, his tone steady and unyielding. Paul lunged forward, grabbing Damon by the shoulder and yanking him roughly around. "Because I told you to," Paul growled, his voice low and dangerous. Daniel stood just behind, his posture casual, though his smirk hinted at the enjoyment he took from the unfolding scene. "You should know better," Daniel taunted. "He doesn't like to repeat himself." Damon staggered slightly but kept his balance, his expression neutral. "Am I under arrest?" Paul slammed him against the hood, pinning him with an arm pressed firmly into his back. "You think you're funny? You're lucky we haven't hauled you in already. Resisting is only going to make it worse." "I haven't resisted anything," Damon said, his voice muffled slightly by the hood's searing heat. "Not yet," Paul spat back, pressing harder. "But you're testing my patience." Daniel stepped closer, crossing his arms as he loomed over Damon. "You've got quite the mouth on you. That's the problem with guys like you. Always thinking you're smarter than us." Paul straightened, grabbing Damon by the arm and hauling him upright. Damon winced, but maintained his footing, his eyes steady despite the pain. "Spread your legs," Paul barked. Damon hesitated, just long enough to draw another aggressive shove from Paul. "I said spread them!" This time, Damon complied, gripping the hood as Paul patted him down with exaggerated force. The officer's hands lingered far longer than necessary, each movement calculated to intimidate. "Empty," Paul muttered, stepping back in frustration. "Clean pockets, clean car. Nothing adds up." He turned to Daniel, his tone sharp. "Maybe we're not looking hard enough." Daniel smirked, leaning casually against the car. "Or maybe he just hasn't told us where he's hiding it yet." Paul's eyes gleamed at the suggestion. He turned back to Damon, gripping him by the collar and pulling him inches from the hood. "You hiding something on you? Or do we need to check somewhere more personal?" Damon's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "There's nothing to find, because I haven't done anything." Paul's laugh was harsh, cutting through the thick air. "That's not how this works. You don't get to decide what's true. We do." Before Damon could respond, Paul shoved him hard against the hood again. The metallic thud echoed as Damon's sunglasses clattered to the asphalt. "Paul," Daniel interjected, his tone laced with faint amusement. "Don't break him before we get him downtown." Paul ignored the remark, leaning in close to Damon's ear. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? Think someone's going to come save you out here?" Damon's voice was low but unshaken. "I don't need anyone to save me." Paul pulled back slightly, sneering. "Big words for someone about to lose everything. You've got nothing to hide, huh? Then you won't mind if we check a little deeper." He gestured for Daniel to grab the gym bag from the trunk. Daniel moved quickly, unzipping the bag with unnecessary force and dumping its contents onto the ground. A pair of running shoes, a water bottle, and a crumpled towel spilled out onto the asphalt. "Nothing," Daniel announced, his frustration clear. Paul's face contorted in rage. "This doesn't make sense. There's something here. There's always something." He spun back toward Damon, gripping his shirt and pulling him upright again. "You're hiding something. I know you are." Damon met his glare, his voice steady but cutting. "You've already found all there is to find. Maybe it's time to stop before you dig yourself in any deeper." Paul froze for a moment, his grip tightening as the weight of Damon's words sank in. The cracks in his authority were widening, and Damon knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Paul's scowl deepened as his grip reflexively tightened, his earlier confidence giving way to a flicker of unease. It was fleeting, but Damon caught it. A crack in the facade. Paul masked it quickly with a sneer, shoving Damon back against the hood once more. "You think you're smart, huh?" he snarled before stepping away, his movements abrupt and tense. "We'll see how smart you are when this goes on record." Daniel, standing near the trunk, chuckled, his hands on his hips. "Looks like you're having a rough day, man." Damon straightened, brushing off his shirt and turning to face them both. "You have no idea." Paul stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "Keep running that mouth. It's going to be your last mistake." The air was thick with tension, suffocating under the heat of the afternoon sun, but Damon stayed calm, every shove, every insult, and every taunt adding to the arsenal of evidence he was gathering. The officers were so consumed by their arrogance that they didn't realize they were sealing their own fate. The metallic clang of the trunk slamming shut echoed down the empty road. Daniel approached Paul, a confident smirk plastered across his face as he held up the planted bag of powder. "Look what I found," he said, tossing it to Paul, who caught it effortlessly. Paul held the bag up to the sunlight, examining it as though it were some prized artifact. His grin widened as he turned his gaze to Damon. Well, he drawled. "Guess you're not as squeaky clean as you'd like to think, huh?" Damon stood by the hood of his car, his chest rising and falling steadily. His voice, however, was unwavering. "That's not mine." Paul let out a sharp, mocking laugh, shaking his head. "Of course it's not. It never is, right? Same old story, same old excuses." He turned to Daniel, who was leaning casually against the cruiser. "They always say it's not theirs. Isn't that cute?" Daniel chuckled as he pushed off the car, strolling closer. "Real cute," he added, glancing at Damon. "You should have just stayed quiet. Would have made this a lot easier for you." "I said it's not mine," Damon snapped, his voice booming with intensity. He took a step forward, his body tense, but Paul shoved him back, forcing him to stumble against the scorching hood. "Watch it!" Paul barked, jabbing a finger in Damon's face. "You don't get to make demands here. You don't get to yell. You're lucky we're not cuffing you right now." Damon gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the edge of the hood to steady himself. Anger flared in his chest, but he forced it down, keeping his focus. Paul stepped closer, holding the bag just inches from Damon's face. "So, if this isn't yours, then whose is it? Did it just fall out of the sky?" Damon's glare was sharp, his voice low and cutting. "You planted it, and you know it." Paul smirked, unbothered by the accusation. He tossed the bag back to Daniel, who caught it with a mocking laugh. "Planted it? Sure. Whatever you say, tough guy," Daniel jeered. "Yeah, let's see how that works out for you." "Oh, Your Honor, the cops framed me," he laughed again, loud and derisive. Paul's voice turned deadly calm as he stepped closer. "Here's the thing. Nobody cares what you say. All they're going to see is this bag, your face, and our report. That's the only story they'll need." Damon's voice cut through the officer's confidence, sharp and defiant. "You're lying, and you know it. You think that badge makes you untouchable, but you're nothing but criminals." For the first time, Daniel's smirk faltered, though Paul's demeanor remained cold and steady. He leaned in close, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're smart, don't you? Think you're going to talk your way out of this? Out here, I'm the law. What I say goes. You don't have rights. You have what I give you." Paul grabbed Damon's shoulder roughly, spinning him around and slamming him harder against the hood. "Now, you listen to me," he hissed, his tone low and threatening. "You keep running that mouth, and I'll give you something to yell about. You think anyone's coming to save you? Think anyone cares?" Damon's voice remained steady, unbroken. "You should be careful, officer." Paul froze momentarily, his grip tightening reflexively. Then he barked out a bitter laugh, loud and mocking. "Careful! You don't get to tell me what to do. You're in my world now, boy." Daniel sauntered over, tossing the bag into the open window of the cruiser with a lazy flick. "Looks like he's all talk, Paul. Let's just take him in and get this over with." Paul turned back to Damon, grabbing him by the front of his shirt and yanking him upright. "You think this ends here? It doesn't. You're mine now. You're going to jail, and no one's going to believe a word you say." Damon locked eyes with him, his voice cold and deliberate. "You don't even realize what you've done, do you?" Paul scoffed, shoving Damon back against the hood one final time. "The only thing I've done is my job." Daniel laughed behind him. "You're just mad we caught you. Go ahead, keep yelling. It's not going to change anything." Paul leaned in closer, his grin widening. "This is how it ends for you. Get used to it." Damon's expression remained unreadable, but he knew the truth. The officers were blind to their own destruction, oblivious to the cameras recording every move, every insult, every planted piece of evidence. Paul gestured toward the cruiser. "Cuff him. We're done here." Daniel stepped forward, reaching for Damon's wrists, but before the cuffs clicked shut, Damon's voice rang out, calm and razor-sharp. "You're going to regret this." Paul laughed bitterly, his confidence still unwavering. "The only regret I have is not dragging you in sooner." As the cuffs tightened, Damon silently prepared for what would come next. The officers believed they had won, but they had no idea the storm they had just unleashed. The cruiser's hum filled the silence as it glided down the empty road, Damon stiff in the back seat. The tight cuffs bit into his wrists, but he didn't flinch. The afternoon sun painted streaks of light across his face, but the heat barely registered. His mind was elsewhere, back in that courtroom 2 years ago. He could still see Marcus, shackled and silent, as Paul Wright sat on the witness stand, smirking while spilling his lies. Damon remembered the judge's gavel striking down with finality, the sound like a slap. Marcus had screamed his innocence until his voice broke, but no one cared. No one listened. Paul and Daniel had planted something on him then, too. Damon had overheard their laughter outside the courthouse. "Clean work," Paul had said smugly, those words haunting Damon ever since. But today wasn't about the past. It was about the present, and this time Damon wasn't helpless. He shifted his gaze out the window, his breathing steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Inside his jacket pocket, his phone recorded everything, silently transmitting it to a secure server. Every insult, every shove, every smug word, they were all preserved, uploading in real time. This wasn't just about him. It was for Marcus, and the years stolen from him. It was for anyone else these men might target. Paul's voice broke the silence, laced with mockery. Awful quiet back there. Starting to realize how bad you screwed up? Damon didn't reply, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. Paul's smirk was unmistakable, his arrogance shining through. Or maybe, Daniel added, twisting in his seat to look at Damon, he's rehearsing his excuses. They always come up with some sob story once we get to booking. Damon's fists clenched behind his back, the cuffs biting into his skin. Marcus's face flashed through his mind again. Defeated. Broken. Damon gritted his teeth. That wouldn't be him. Not this time. You'll have plenty of time to cry it out later, Paul continued, tapping idly on the steering wheel. I hope you're good at making friends. Damon's voice cut through the air, low but unwavering. You planted that bag. Paul snorted, turning his head just enough to shoot Damon a condescending glance. Planted it? Is that your story? You think anyone's going to believe that? Damon tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It's the truth. Daniel laughed sharply, shaking his head. Man, you've got some imagination. Maybe you can pitch that story when they throw you in front of the judge. Damon turned back to the window, tuning out their jeers. His mind raced. The footage was safe, secure, and uploading as they spoke. He pictured the moment it went live, the outrage spreading online. People would see the truth. The question was when to reveal it. Now, or when they least expected it. Paul's voice snapped him back to the present. You know, I almost feel bad for you. It's always the same. Think you're smarter than us, then boom. He clapped his hands together. We take you down, and no one even remembers your name. Damon's jaw tightened. His voice came sharp and deliberate. What about Marcus Taylor? Do you remember his name? The air in the cruiser shifted. Silence hung heavy for a moment. A punch that landed squarely. Daniel glanced at Paul, his smirk wavering. Paul recovered quickly, though his annoyance flickered. Doesn't ring a bell, he said flatly, though Damon caught the strain in his voice. You all look the same to me. Damon's gaze hardened as he met Paul's eyes in the rearview mirror. His voice was like a blade. You remember him. You put him away, lied to a judge, and smiled while you did it. Paul's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. His voice, however, stayed cocky. Careful what you say back there. Wouldn't want to add defamation to your charges. Damon leaned back, his breathing steady once more. You'll remember his name soon enough. Paul dismissed him with a bitter laugh. Big talk for someone in cuffs. The police station loomed on the horizon, its gray silhouette growing closer with every second. Damon's heartbeat quickened, though his face remained calm. Not yet. Timing was everything. Let them believe they had won. Let them smirk and laugh. Soon, the world would know the truth. The holding cell was cramped and suffocating. The dull clang of the metal door locking behind him echoed in the near-empty room. Damon barely registered the sound. The air was heavy with the stale smell of sweat and metal, a reminder of the countless lives processed through these walls. He sat on the bench, the cold steel pressing into his back, but his mind was far from defeated. This was the moment he had prepared for, the culmination of months of planning. Paul and Daniel thought they were invincible, that they could manipulate the system without consequence. But the footage would expose them. Damon closed his eyes, steadying his breath. The cuffs still pressed against his wrists, but their bite felt less sharp now. He thought of Marcus again, his voice, his pain. This is for you, Marcus, for all of us. And then he waited. Damon sat still on the edge of the narrow bench, his wrists free of the cuffs, but aching nonetheless. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his composure unshaken despite the storm brewing just beyond the bars. He glanced up, locking eyes briefly with Paul, who stood outside the cell, his trademark smug grin plastered across his face. Daniel leaned against the far wall, hands in his pockets, the same lazy smirk lingering, though it seemed thinner now, more forced. You getting comfy in there? Paul taunted, his voice dripping with condescension. Looks good on you. Damon said nothing, his gaze dropping back to the scuffed concrete floor. "I told you this was how it ends," Paul continued, stepping closer to the bars. "You think you're smart? You think that little attitude was going to save you? Newsflash, you're done. You hear me? Done." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Still quiet. "Guess it's sinking in now, huh? The tough guy acts all worn out." Damon exhaled slowly, the sound calm and deliberate. He thought of Marcus again, his brother sitting in this same station 2 years ago, wearing the same cuffs, hearing the same jeers from the same men. He could still see Marcus's defeated, empty eyes when Damon visited him after the verdict. That memory had burned itself into his mind, fueling every choice he'd made since. Today, it all came full circle. Damon lifted his head, meeting Paul's glare with deliberate calm. His voice was measured, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You really think you've won?" Paul's smirk faltered for a split second before irritation replaced it. "What was that?" Damon leaned forward slightly, his tone unwavering. "I said you haven't won anything." Paul scoffed, though the strain in his voice betrayed him. "You're locked up in a cell, genius. I'd say that's a win for me." Damon's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, the first since the encounter began. "It's funny you say that." Daniel shifted uneasily, his smirk thinning. "What's funny?" Damon tilted his head, his voice cool and steady. "The fact that you think you're in control. You're not. You haven't been all day." Paul's fists clenched at his sides as he stepped closer to the bars. "What the hell are you talking about?" Leaning back against the cold wall, Damon's tone turned matter-of-fact. "You didn't search me very well, did you? While you were busy playing tough guys, you didn't notice that I've been recording this whole thing. Cameras, mics, everything." The room fell silent. For a moment, even the air seemed to freeze. Paul's face turned red as realization crept in, his voice cracking with anger. "What did you just say?" Damon's gaze didn't waver. "I said every shove, every insult, every lie. It's all on tape, and it's already been sent to someone else." Daniel straightened, his smirk vanishing entirely. "What do you mean, sent?" Damon's voice sharpened, deliberate and cutting. "While you were too busy framing me, the footage was uploading to a secure drive. My friends got it, and if I don't check in soon, it's going online." Paul's face contorted with fury, his voice rising. "You're lying. You're bluffing!" Damon shrugged, completely unfazed. "Go ahead. Keep thinking that." Daniel turned to Paul, his voice tight with unease. "Paul, what if he's not bluffing?" "Shut up!" Paul snapped, his voice cracking as his anger boiled over. He spun back to Damon, gripping the bars with white-knuckled intensity. "You're bluffing. There's no damn footage." Damon's gaze stayed locked on Paul's. "You want to take that chance? Go ahead, but I'd bet by now my friend's already watching it, getting ready to post it." Paul's breathing grew heavier, his hands shaking as he leaned in closer. "You think this is a joke? You think you can threaten us?" "I'm not threatening you," Damon replied coolly. "You already did this to yourselves." Daniel stepped forward, his composure cracking. "If that's true..." "It is," Damon interjected, cutting him off, "and you're out of time. Every second you stand here, you're giving them more to see." Paul slammed a fist against the bars, the metallic clang echoing through the room. His voice was raw with desperation. "You think this changes anything? You think anyone's going to care about your little video? You're nothing. Nothing." Damon's voice dropped to a low, deadly calm. "We'll see who's nothing when they see the truth, when everyone sees what you did to me, to Marcus." Paul froze, his jaw twitching. Daniel looked at him uneasily. "Marcus?" Damon nodded, his gaze unwavering. "That's right. You remember him, don't you? You ruined his life, and now everyone's going to know what you did, what you've been doing for years." Paul stepped back, his chest heaving as panic flashed in his eyes. He turned to Daniel, his voice sharp and frantic. "We need to fix this." "There's nothing you can fix," Damon said, leaning back against the wall, his tone calm and satisfied. "It's over." The two officers stood frozen, the weight of Damon's words crashing down on them. The air in the holding cell was thick with tension, suffocating and inescapable. Paul paced frantically outside the cell, his boots thudding against the tile floor. "He's bluffing," he muttered to himself, his voice strained, though it was clear he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "He's not bluffing, Paul," Daniel hissed, his face pale, his voice tight with panic. He gripped the desk phone so hard his knuckles turned white. If that video's out there, it's going to go everywhere. It's not just us. It's the whole damn department. Shut up, Paul snapped, spinning to face Daniel. We can control this. But even as he said it, the truth was clear. Control was already out of their hands. Damon watched them both unravel, his expression steady, knowing the clock was ticking. This was for Marcus, for justice, and there was no stopping what was coming. Damon sat on the narrow bench, his wrists aching from the cuffs, but his resolve stronger than ever. The faint smirk on his lips deepened as Paul's world began to crumble around him. The ringing phone on the desk shattered the tense silence, its sharp tone reverberating through the small station. Paul froze mid-step, his confidence faltering for the first time. Daniel turned toward the sound, his expression shifting from smug arrogance to creeping dread. He stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. "Ignore it," Paul growled, his voice lacking the authority it once carried. The ringing stopped momentarily, but the reprieve was short-lived. The phone started again, louder and more insistent. Daniel cursed under his breath, stepping back toward the corner of the room, his composure cracking. Damon leaned back against the cold wall of his cell, his faint smile growing. "That's your problem now," he said calmly. Paul stormed to the desk, grabbing the phone with a white-knuckled grip. "What?" He barked into the receiver, his voice sharp and angry. His expression shifted as he listened. First confusion, then shock, and finally pale-faced horror. "No, that's not," he began, but his voice faltered, his jaw clenched, his free hand trembling at his side. "Where did you—" He didn't finish the sentence, slamming the phone down with enough force to make the desk shake. The sound echoed through the station. Paul turned back to Damon, his face red with fury, his breathing uneven. "You did this," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. Damon didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was already spreading, and Paul knew it. Daniel's voice wavered, panic bleeding into his words. "Paul, it's already on Twitter. People are tagging the chief. They're asking for statements." Paul spun toward Daniel, his face contorted with anger. "Shut up and figure out how to stop it." Daniel fumbled for his phone, scrolling frantically through notifications, the glow of the screen reflecting his wide-eyed panic. "Oh no, oh no," he muttered. "Paul, this is bad. It's everywhere." Paul looked ready to explode, but before he could act, the front door of the station swung open with a sharp thud. All heads turned as a tall man in a navy suit strode in, a leather briefcase in one hand and determination etched across his face. "Who the hell are you?" Paul barked, his voice cracking. The man didn't blink. "I'm Mr. Langston, Damon Taylor's attorney. I'm here to secure my client's immediate release." Paul scoffed, though the conviction in his voice was gone. "He's being processed. He's not going anywhere." Mr. Langston stopped a few feet from Paul, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "I suggest you reconsider," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm sure you're aware that my client's footage of this unlawful stop and assault is trending online. Unless you'd like to add wrongful imprisonment to your already impressive list of violations, you're going to let Mr. Taylor out." "Now!" Daniel froze, his voice trembling. "Trending!" "Shut up, Daniel," Paul roared, but his voice was tinged with desperation. Langston turned to the desk officer, who had been watching the scene in stunned silence. "Open the cell," he instructed curtly. The officer hesitated, his eyes darting between Paul and Langston, but the lawyer's authority left little room for argument. Slowly, he reached for the keys. Paul's face contorted with rage, but he was losing control, and he knew it. The keys rattled as the officer unlocked the cell door, swinging it open with a loud creak. Damon rose slowly, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness. He stepped out, his composure unshaken, his gaze locking with Paul's. Paul stepped forward, his voice raw with anger. "You're not walking out of here clean. You hear me? This isn't over." Damon turned to face him fully, his eyes cold and unwavering. "You're right. It's not over. Not for you." Langston gestured for Damon to follow. Together, they walked toward the station's front door. As they passed Daniel, the younger officer stood frozen, his phone still glowing in his hand. Damon caught a glimpse of the footage playing on the screen. Paul's furious face, his voice unmistakable. Paul's voice boomed behind them, desperate and furious. "You think you've won? You're going to regret this." Damon stopped just before the door, turning slightly. His voice was calm, razor sharp. "No, Paul, I think you're the one who's going to regret it." With that, he stepped outside into the afternoon light. The door closed behind him with a final, resounding clang. The cool air hit Damon's skin as he walked beside Langston, the chaos of the last few hours fading behind him. The parking lot was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. "Are you all right?" Langston asked, his tone calm but serious. Damon rubbed his wrists, faint red marks where the cuffs had been digging into his skin. "I'll be fine," he replied, his voice steady but his thoughts racing. He stopped just short of the parking lot's edge, turning back to look at the station. Through the wide glass doors, he could still see the chaos inside. Paul and Daniel were arguing with the desk officer, their motions frantic, their faces contorted with anger and panic. Langston followed Damon's gaze. "They're done," he said firmly. "The footage has already spread too far. You did exactly what you needed to do." Damon nodded, his chest rising and falling with the first sense of relief he'd felt all day. "This was for Marcus," he said quietly, "and for everyone else they've hurt." Langston placed a reassuring hand on Damon's shoulder. "And now it's their turn to answer for it." Together, they walked toward the parking lot, leaving the storm behind them. Damon exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just enough to release the tension that had been coiled there all day. "It's not enough," he said, his voice steady but laced with lingering bitterness. Langston tilted his head, studying him with measured calm. "It's enough for today. Let the system do its work now." Damon turned to face him fully, his jaw tightening as the words sank in. "The system?" He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "The system is what put my brother in prison. The system didn't work for Marcus. He never even got the chance to let it work." Langston's expression softened, though his tone remained steady. "This time, it's different. You made sure of that. The department's under a microscope now. Internal Affairs is already on it. Paul and Daniel are scrambling, but it's too late. They're done. The system will hold them accountable this time." Damon looked away, his gaze settling on the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip below the skyline. The orange glow stretched long and unforgiving across the parking lot, painting everything in stark contrast. "You saw Marcus, right?" Damon's voice was quiet now, filled with a pain that had simmered for years. "He sat in a cell for 2 years. 2 years, because of their lies. My mom had to mortgage her house just to fight it, and they still won." Langston stepped closer, placing a firm hand on Damon's shoulder. "And now, they've exposed themselves. This time, they won't win." Damon nodded faintly, his eyes narrowing as they drifted back to the station. "They thought they were untouchable," he said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "That no one would believe me, just like Marcus. But now everyone sees them for what they are." Langston checked his watch, his professional demeanor reasserting itself. "Your friend sent me a message right before I got here. The footage has hit all the major platforms. News outlets are picking it up, and people are sharing it everywhere. That video speaks for itself, Damon. There's no covering it up." Damon's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Good." The faint creak of the station doors pulled their attention. Paul stormed outside, his face a deep, furious red, his fists clenched tightly at his sides as he stomped toward them. Daniel trailed behind, his earlier smugness replaced with wide-eyed panic. His gaze darted nervously around the parking lot, as though expecting someone to intervene. "Hey!" Paul's voice boomed across the lot as he closed the distance. "You think this is over? You think some stupid video is going to change anything?" Langston stepped forward immediately, his presence commanding as he blocked Paul's path. "You don't speak to my client," he said, his voice sharp and cutting. "Not another word." Paul ignored him, his glare fixed on Damon like a laser. "You think you're a hero? You think people are going to side with you? You're just another—" "Don't!" Damon interrupted, his voice cutting through Paul's tirade like a blade. His calm, unwavering tone made Paul falter mid-sentence. "You don't get to talk anymore." Paul froze, his fists still shaking at his sides, but he said nothing. Daniel lingered a few steps behind, glancing nervously toward the station doors, his panic clear. Damon stepped forward just enough to close the distance, his composure unbroken. "Your time is up, Paul. You and your little partner here? How many people did you lie about? How many lives did you ruin because you thought no one would call you out?" Paul opened his mouth to respond, but his voice wavered. Damon didn't let him finish. "This isn't just about me or Marcus. It's about every single person you've done this to. You got away with it for years, but not this time." Paul's chest heaved with ragged breaths, but he remained silent. Daniel stood frozen, his face pale as the gravity of the situation weighed on him. Langston stepped in again, his voice sharp and commanding. "You should get back inside. I'm sure your department will have plenty of questions for you. You might want to start preparing your answers." Paul's glare shifted between Langston and Damon. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. With a frustrated growl, he turned sharply and stomped back toward the station, shoving past Daniel. Daniel followed hesitantly, his steps slow and his head hanging low. Damon watched them retreat, his expression blank but his resolve unshaken. The weight of the moment pressed on him like a heavy stone, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. Langston adjusted his tie, turning to Damon with a nod. "Come on, let's get out of here. You've done enough for today." Damon followed Langston across the lot, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows behind them. His phone buzzed faintly in his pocket. A notification, but he didn't need to check it. He already knew what it would say. The world had seen the truth, and this time, the truth would win. The glow of Damon's phone lit up as he sat across from Langston in his office. The room was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the station. Screens mounted on the walls displayed muted news broadcasts, every major channel cycling through the same headline: "Shocking police misconduct, caught on camera, officers under investigation." The footage played in endless loops, Paul's face twisted in rage, the officers' voices echoing their threats and slurs. A scrolling ticker of social media comments lined the bottom of the screen. How many others have they done this to? Hold them accountable. "Justice for Damon and his brother Marcus." Langston's voice broke the silence as he set a file on the table. "Internal Affairs called an hour ago. Both officers have been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. It's moving faster than I expected." Damon nodded slightly, his expression calm but distant. "They're scared. Scared doesn't even begin to cover it," Langston replied, sitting across from him. He opened the file, sliding over printed screenshots of headlines and online reactions. The footage has hit over 10 million views in less than 24 hours. News outlets are covering it non-stop. Damon leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile playing at his lips. Good. The truth was out, and this time, there was no going back. Damon sat still, his focus locked on the document in his hands, the weight of the names within pressing heavily on his conscience. Each name told a story, stories that had been whispered, ignored, or outright dismissed, victims of Paul and Daniel's unchecked abuse of power. "I knew it wasn't just us," Damon murmured, his voice low but firm, his hands tightening into fists. Langston leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "It's not just you. Enough has come forward already to expose them, and the system that protected them, for good. Once Internal Affairs finishes their investigation, this could bring down more than just Wright and Moore. It could force a reckoning across the department." Damon looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Langston adjusted his tie, his professional calm unwavering. "The department knows this is a nightmare for them. They'll want to end it quietly. They'll offer you a settlement, fire Wright and Moore, and claim they're cleaning house to protect their reputation. But you and I both know that won't fix the deeper problem." Damon's jaw clenched as his thoughts drifted to Marcus, his brother, robbed of 2 years of his life because no one questioned Paul's lies, the mortgage their mother had taken out to fight an impossible battle, the humiliation and defeat Marcus had endured in silence. Damon's voice came firm and unwavering. "It's not just about them. It's about the system that let them get away with it. If I take their money and walk away, nothing changes. Someone else will step into their place." A flicker of pride crossed Langston's face, as he slid another document across the table. I thought you'd say that. I've started compiling the names of other victims who've reached out. We don't just push for their firing. We demand a full investigation into every case they've touched. We expose it all. Damon took the document, flipping through the names. Familiar stories leapt out. Names and faces he'd heard about in passing, buried in small-town gossip or obscure articles. Stories no one had believed, until now. Damon's voice was steady, his resolve solidified. Do it. Whatever it takes. They don't get to bury this. Before Langston could reply, Damon's phone buzzed loudly on the table. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Take it, Langston said, his tone measured. It could be important. Damon picked up the phone and pressed it to his ear. Hello? The voice on the other end was low, venomous, and unmistakably Paul's. You think this is over? Damon froze, his muscles tightening as he recognized the seething anger in Paul's tone. Langston watched carefully, his expression sharpening as he saw Damon's reaction. You set me up, Paul hissed. You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know what you've started. Damon remained silent, his grip tightening on the phone as Paul's tirade continued. You're going to regret this. You and your brother. You think people care about you? They don't. You're nothing. And Damon cut him off, his voice cold and unyielding. You're done, Paul. You can't threaten me anymore. The world knows who you are now. Paul's breathing was heavy on the other end, each exhale sharp and angry. Beneath the venom, Damon could hear desperation creeping in, the realization that Paul was no longer in control. Your badge doesn't protect you anymore, Damon added, his tone unwavering. And neither does your silence. Before Paul could respond, Damon ended the call and set the phone down on the table with a deliberate motion. Langston leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. That was him, wasn't it? Damon nodded. Yeah, he's scared. Langston gestured toward the TV mounted on the wall, where yet another news anchor was interviewing a victim of police misconduct. He should be. It's too late for him to backtrack now. He's unraveling, and the more he fights, the worse it'll get. Damon leaned back in his chair, his gaze hard and unwavering. Good, let him unravel. People like him only learn when they lose everything. Langston tapped a pen against the table thoughtfully. The department will contact us soon, trying to negotiate. When they do, we'll push harder. But you've started something here, Damon. A lot of people are counting on you now. Damon met Langston's gaze, his voice steady and resolute. I'm not stopping. Not until they're held accountable for everything they've done. Langston nodded approvingly. Then we'll keep pushing. For Marcus. For everyone. In the dim light of his kitchen, Paul sat hunched over the table, his phone buzzing incessantly with missed calls, messages, and notifications. He didn't bother answering anymore. The chants of protesters echoed faintly from somewhere down the block, louder and closer each day. His grip on the table's edge was tight, his knuckles white as he stared blankly at the flickering TV. Today, Officer Paul Wright and Officer Daniel Moore were officially suspended without pay, pending a formal investigation. Protests are expected to escalate. Paul slammed his fist against the table, his voice low and venomous. Lies, he muttered through gritted teeth. All of it. The phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a familiar name. Daniel Moore. Paul hesitated before answering. What? Daniel's voice came frantic, nearly hysterical. We're screwed, Paul. Do you see what they're saying? Internal Affairs just called me. They're talking charges, man. Charges. Paul clenched his jaw, his voice dripping with anger. Calm down. This isn't over. They've got nothing but a damn video. It's enough, Daniel shot back. They're digging into everything now. Every arrest, every report. We can't hide it anymore. Paul ran a hand through his hair, sweat glistening on his forehead. We'll figure this out. The union will back us. You don't get it, Daniel snapped, his voice breaking. They're not backing us. They're throwing us to the wolves. We're done, Paul. We're done. Paul slammed the phone down, his breathing ragged, the sounds of protesters growing louder outside. For the first time, he felt the walls closing in, the realization hitting like a freight train. This time, there was no way out. Daniel sat slumped in a chair, his shoulders hunched, sweat dripping down the back of his neck. The interrogation room felt suffocating, and the silence between the two internal affairs investigators was more oppressive than the heat. One of the investigators slid a stack of printed photos across the table, each still taken directly from Damon's footage. "We have you on video," the investigator said, his voice calm but relentless. "Planting evidence, harassing Mr. Taylor, violating protocol. That alone could cost you your badge." Daniel's voice trembled as he tried to respond. "That wasn't—" "Save it," the second investigator cut him off, flipping through more files. "This stops today. You either cooperate with us now, or you'll go down harder than right. It's your choice." Daniel sank lower in his seat, his face pale as the weight of the consequences pressed down on him. "I was just following orders," he muttered weakly, knowing it wouldn't save him. Meanwhile, Damon sat in Langston's office, his phone lighting up with notifications. Protests had erupted outside the police department. People were holding signs with slogans like "Justice for Marcus Taylor" and "Hold Wright and Moore Accountable." Videos flooded social media, crowds chanting, and news anchors analyzing the scandal. Officials were scrambling to respond. Langston sat across from Damon, flipping through a thick legal document. "It's happening," Langston said, his tone steady. "Both officers are facing criminal charges: misconduct, falsifying evidence, assault. Paul Wright is refusing to cooperate, but Moore is already cracking. He's trying to shift the blame." Damon leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "They deserve everything that's coming to them." Langston nodded. "The DA's office is preparing their case now. This is bigger than just the video. We've uncovered evidence that Wright and Moore have been falsifying arrests for years. Your footage opened the door." Damon's gaze moved to the window, where the faint glow of police lights flickered against the evening sky. "It's not enough yet." Langston raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? This is a massive win. You've exposed them." Damon turned back to him, his voice cold and measured. "I want them to feel what Marcus felt. Powerless, alone, like their whole world is collapsing." Langston nodded slowly. "They're feeling it already. Paul Wright's name is ruined. His neighbors are protesting outside his house. Daniel Moore's family has been getting threats. They'll both lose their badges and their freedom if we're lucky." Damon exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly. "Good." Langston stood, gathering his papers. "The trial's coming. Be ready. You'll have to testify against them. It won't be easy. They'll try to smear you, just like they did to Marcus." Damon's gaze sharpened, his resolve firm. "Let them try. This time, they don't control the story. I do." Back at Paul Wright's house, the glow of the TV flickered in the darkened living room. He sat slumped in a chair, watching a news anchor read a statement. "Officer Wright and Officer Moore are expected to face formal charges later this week." The footage released by Damon Taylor has sparked widespread protests and demands for police accountability across the state. Paul's hands trembled as the screen flashed his name next to words like misconduct and corruption. Outside, faint chants grew louder. "Justice for Marcus. Hold Wright accountable." The sound rattled the windows, growing like a rising storm. Paul closed his eyes, his breathing ragged. For the first time, he felt it. The walls were closing in, and there was no way out. The days following the release of the footage felt like a whirlwind for Damon. It was both a victory and the beginning of something much larger. Paul Wright and Daniel Moore had been suspended pending investigation, but that wasn't enough. Not yet. Damon stood outside Langston's office, watching as reporters lined the sidewalks, cameras clicking and microphones aimed at anyone who walked past. He pushed through the glass doors, entering the cool, quiet lobby. Inside, Langston was waiting, his desk cluttered with folders, documents, and a laptop streaming another press conference. He looked up as Damon entered. "You're just in time for this," Langston said, turning the laptop toward him. On screen, the district attorney stood at a podium, surrounded by reporters. Her voice was firm and resolute. "We are pursuing full criminal charges against officers Paul Wright and Daniel Moore, including falsifying evidence, harassment, and excessive use of force. This case is emblematic of a larger issue, and we are committed to seeking justice for all victims affected by their misconduct." Damon exhaled slowly, letting the words sink in. "It's happening." Langston nodded, his eyes sharp. "The DA's office is all in. They're not just going after Wright and Moore for what they did to you. They're reopening dozens of their old cases. The department's scrambling, but it's too late. Damon pulled up a chair, glancing at the thick stack of files on the desk. What about the other victims? Langston pushed a file toward him, flipping it open. Inside were names, photos, and sworn statements. More people had come forward. Victims who had been too scared to speak before. The footage had given them the courage to finally tell their stories. Some of these cases went back over 5 years. It's ugly, Damon. They covered up a lot. Damon's jaw tightened as he scanned the pages, the weight of the names and stories crashing over him. This is what they've been doing. Langston leaned forward, his tone serious. That's why we need you ready. Damon met his gaze, his voice steady and resolute. I'm ready. You're going to be the key witness. Your footage is the cornerstone of the case, but your testimony will tie it all together. Langston's words rang clear in the air, setting the stage for the final push. Damon looked up, his gaze steady and unwavering. I'll be ready. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Langston's office became ground zero for the case, with investigators from the DA's office arriving daily, armed with stacks of reports and videos from other victims. Damon sat through hours of interviews, reliving the encounter frame by frame, making sure there were no gaps in his story. He couldn't afford a single misstep. One afternoon, as Damon reviewed his sworn statement, Langston entered the room with a grim expression. We have more, he said, sliding a folder onto the table. Damon looked up sharply. What do you mean? Daniel Moore is cooperating, Langston said flatly. He's turned on Paul. He's claiming Paul planted the bag, orchestrated everything, and that he was just following orders. Damon's lip curled in disgust. Of course he is. Langston shrugged. It doesn't absolve him. He's guilty, and he knows it. But his cooperation strengthens the case against Wright. He's providing details about other incidents. Incidents where evidence was falsified, where people were targeted for no reason other than convenience or spite. Damon shook his head. They thought they'd get away with it forever. Langston continued. Wright still isn't talking. He's denying everything. Claims the footage is out of context. Damon barked out a bitter laugh. Context? What context justifies planting evidence and threatening someone? Langston sighed, his face hardening. He's digging in. Arrogance is the only thing he has left, but it won't save him in court. Damon nodded slowly. Good. I want him to watch it all fall apart. I want him to see it through to the end. The night before the trial, Damon sat alone at his kitchen table. The hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the quiet apartment. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from his mother. Your brother would be so proud of you. I love you. Damon's throat tightened as he stared at the words. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath. The memories of Marcus flooded back, of him sitting in that cold prison cell, of his voice hoarse from calling home, telling Damon to fix it. You're going to make it right, Marcus had said. Tomorrow, Damon thought. Tomorrow was for him. Tomorrow was for every person Paul and Daniel had crushed under their boots. His phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from his friend, who had helped upload the footage. We'll be watching. You've got this. Damon set the phone down, his resolve hardening. Tomorrow, Paul Wright and Daniel Moore would finally face the consequences of their actions. Tomorrow, the system that had ignored Marcus would be forced to listen. He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the quiet night. The city stretched before him, its lights flickering like distant stars. Somewhere out there, people were waiting to see if justice could still mean something. For Damon, it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, about Marcus, about every name in those files. Tomorrow, the truth would be heard. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. Spectators filled the benches, their eyes trained on the front of the room where 2 tables sat, facing the judge's imposing bench. At one table sat Damon, Langston, and the district attorney, their presence calm and composed. Across from them sat Paul Wright and Daniel Moore, accompanied by their defense attorneys. Paul's usual confidence had been replaced with simmering tension. His jaw was clenched, his eyes scanning the room like he was searching for an escape. Daniel slouched beside him, his expression hollow, sweat beating on his forehead. All rise, the bailiff announced, and the crowd shuffled to their feet as the judge entered. Her gavel struck the wooden block with authority. "Court is now in session," she declared. "The state versus Paul Wright and Daniel Moore. You may be seated." The hum of whispers faded as the district attorney rose, stepping to the center of the room. Her voice was firm, deliberate. "Your Honor, members of the jury, today we will present clear and undeniable evidence of the defendant's abuse of power, their falsification of evidence, and their systemic harassment of citizens, including Mr. Damon Taylor. This case isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of corruption that has hurt countless people." She gestured toward Damon. "Mr. Taylor's bravery in recording his encounter with these officers and coming forward has brought these injustices to light. Today, the truth will finally be heard." The first day of testimony was grueling. The prosecution presented hours of footage. Damon's video played on a large screen for the jury to see. Paul's snarling face filled the room as his voice rang out. His racial slurs, threats, and planted evidence undeniable. Damon watched the jury carefully, noting the range of expressions from stunned to furious as they absorbed the footage. Some glanced toward Paul and Daniel with barely veiled disgust. Langston leaned over and whispered, "It's landing exactly how it needs to." When Damon took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He adjusted the microphone in front of him, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The district attorney began her questioning, her tone firm but supportive. "Mr. Taylor, can you walk us through what happened on the day of your arrest?" Damon nodded, his voice steady. "I was driving home when Officers Wright and Moore pulled me over. They claimed I had a broken tail light, but my car was in perfect condition. They ordered me out of the vehicle and began searching it without my consent." The DA prompted him further. "At any point, did they inform you of your rights or provide a valid reason for the search?" "No," Damon said firmly. "Instead, they planted a bag. You're going to be the key witness. Your footage is the cornerstone of the case, but your testimony will tie it all together." Langston's voice was firm, his eyes unwavering as he spoke. Damon looked up, his gaze steady. "I'll be ready." The next few days blurred together in a haze of preparation. Langston's office became ground zero for the case, with investigators from the DA's office arriving daily, armed with stacks of reports and videos from other victims. Damon sat through hour after hour of interviews, reliving the encounter frame by frame, ensuring that there were no gaps in his story. He couldn't afford a single misstep. One afternoon, as Damon reviewed his sworn statement, Langston entered with a grim expression. "We have more," he said, sliding a folder onto the table. Damon looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Daniel Moore is cooperating," Langston said flatly. "He's turned on Paul. He's claiming Paul planted the bag, orchestrated everything, and that he was just following orders." Damon's lip curled in disgust. "Of course he is," Langston shrugged. "It doesn't absolve him. He's guilty, and he knows it. But his cooperation strengthens the case against Wright. He's providing details about other incidents. Incidents where evidence was falsified, where people were targeted for no reason other than convenience or spite." Damon shook his head. "They thought they'd get away with it forever." Langston continued, "Wright still isn't talking. He's denying everything. Claims the footage is out of context." Damon barked out a bitter laugh. "Context? What context justifies planting evidence and threatening someone?" Langston sighed. "He's digging in. Arrogance is the only thing he has left, but it won't save him in court." Damon nodded slowly. "Good. I want him to watch it all fall apart. I want him to see it through to the end." The night before the trial, Damon sat alone at his kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the quiet apartment. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from his mother. "Your brother would be so proud of you. I love you." Damon's throat tightened as he stared at the words. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath. The memories of Marcus flooded back. His brother, sitting in that cold prison cell, his voice hoarse from calling home, telling Damon to fix it. "You're going to make it right," Marcus had said. Tomorrow. Damon thought, tomorrow was for him. Tomorrow was for every person Paul and Daniel had crushed under their boots. His phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from his friend, who had helped upload the footage. "We'll be watching. You've got this." Damon set the phone down, his resolve hardening. Tomorrow, Paul Wright and Daniel Moore would finally face the consequences of their actions. Tomorrow, the system that had ignored Marcus would be forced to listen. He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the quiet night. The city stretched before him, its lights flickering like distant stars. Somewhere out there, people were waiting to see if justice could still mean something. For Damon, it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, about Marcus, about every name in those files. Tomorrow, the truth would be heard. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Spectators filled the benches, their eyes trained on the front of the room where two tables sat, facing the judge's imposing bench. At one table sat Damon, Langston, and the district attorney, their presence calm and composed. Across from them sat Paul Wright and Daniel Moore, their defense attorneys beside them. Paul's usual confidence had been replaced with simmering tension. His jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the room like he was searching for an escape. Daniel slouched beside him, his expression hollow, sweat beating on his forehead. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the crowd shuffled to their feet as the judge entered. Her gavel struck the wooden block with authority. "Court is now in session," she declared. "The state versus Paul Wright and Daniel Moore. You may be seated." The hum of whispers faded as the district attorney rose, stepping to the center of the room. Her voice was firm, deliberate. "Your Honor, members of the jury, today we will present clear and undeniable evidence of the defendant's abuse of power, their falsification of evidence, and their systemic harassment of citizens, including Mr. Damon Taylor. This case isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of corruption that has hurt countless people." She gestured toward Damon. "Mr. Taylor's bravery in recording his encounter with these officers and coming forward has brought these injustices to light. Today, the truth will finally be heard." The first day of testimony was grueling. The prosecution presented hours of footage. Damon's video played on a large screen for the jury to see. Paul's snarling face filled the room as his voice rang out, his racial slurs, threats, and planted evidence undeniable. Damon watched the jury carefully, noting their expressions, ranging from stunned to furious, as they absorbed the footage. Some glanced toward Paul and Daniel with barely veiled disgust. Langston leaned over and whispered, "It's landing exactly how it needs to." When Damon took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He adjusted the microphone in front of him, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The district attorney began her questioning, her tone firm but supportive. "Mr. Taylor, can you walk us through what happened on the day of your arrest?" Damon nodded, his voice steady. "I was driving home when Officers Wright and Moore pulled me over. They claimed I had a broken tail light, but my car was in perfect condition. They ordered me out of the vehicle and began searching it without my consent." The DA prompted him further. "At any point, did they inform you of your rights or provide a valid reason for the search?" "No," Damon said firmly. "Instead, they planted a bag." The defense was desperate. When it was their turn, they leaned into their strategy of deflection. Paul's attorney stood, adjusting his tie as he approached Damon. "Mr. Taylor, wouldn't you agree that police officers have a difficult and dangerous job?" Damon's expression didn't waver. "A difficult job doesn't give anyone the right to lie or ruin lives." The attorney's tone grew sharper. "You're upset about what happened to your brother, aren't you? Couldn't it be argued that you were targeting these officers out of a personal vendetta?" Damon sat up straighter, his voice calm but firm. "What happened to my brother is why I installed the cameras. Yes, but I didn't force these officers to lie, to plant evidence, or to threaten me. They made those choices." The defense attorney faltered slightly before stepping back. No further questions. By the third day, Daniel Moore was called to the stand. As part of a plea deal, his betrayal of Paul sent ripples through the courtroom. Daniel's hands shook as he gripped the stand, avoiding eye contact with Paul. "It was his idea," Daniel said, his voice trembling. Paul always led these stops. He'd say we needed to keep people like Damon in their place. I went along with it because I was afraid of what he'd do if I didn't. Paul glared at Daniel, his face twisting in rage. "You lying coward," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the judge to hear. "Miss!" the judge barked. "One more outburst, and you'll be removed from this courtroom." Daniel's testimony was damning. He detailed how Paul had orchestrated arrests, falsified reports, and targeted people they thought wouldn't fight back. His words painted a picture of systemic corruption that went beyond just the two of them. When the prosecution rested, the courtroom was tense. The defense scrambled to salvage what they could, but the evidence was overwhelming. Langston leaned toward Damon. "This is it. They've got nothing left." Damon nodded, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Paul, who sat rigid, his face pale, hands clenched into fists. The judge adjourned for the day, setting up the final arguments for the next morning. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Damon sat with Langston at the prosecution's table, his hands folded tightly. The judge entered the room and took her seat. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the entire room stood as one. The judge's gavel struck once, her voice calm but firm. "Be seated." Damon's eyes flickered briefly toward the jury box. 12 people sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable, but the weight of the past days was etched into their faces. He exhaled slowly as the judge turned toward the defense table, where Paul Wright sat with his attorney. Paul's face was pale, his once cocky confidence replaced by quiet rage. Daniel Moore sat beside him, his shoulders slumped, unable to look at anyone. The judge began, her voice carrying authority that cut through the heavy room. "Before I proceed with the verdict and sentencing, let me make something very clear. This court has reviewed overwhelming evidence of misconduct, abuse of power, and the falsification of arrests by both defendants, Paul Wright and Daniel Moore. What this case? Furthermore, I am ordering that all cases connected to these two defendants be reopened and re-examined immediately for every individual who was wronged by their misconduct. This court will ensure justice is restored." The judge's words rang out like a thunderclap, leaving no room for doubt. Damon inhaled sharply, his mind flashing to Marcus. "It's happening." The judge struck the gavel once more, signaling the end of the trial. "Court is adjourned." The room erupted into noise, reporters whispering, people crying, families hugging one another in relief. Damon sat frozen, absorbing it all. Langston placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice steady. "It's done. Damon, you did it." Damon nodded slowly, his voice quiet. "It's not just for me. It's for Marcus, for everyone they hurt." Across the room, Damon's gaze locked on Paul, who was being handcuffed by court officers. Paul shot him a venomous glare, unrepentant, but Damon didn't flinch. Paul's words earlier, his threats, meant nothing now. He was done. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like a broken man. His head hung low as he muttered something to his attorney. Damon didn't feel pity for either of them. This was justice. Finally, outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Reporters jockeyed for position, cameras flashing as Damon and Langston emerged from the building. The chants of the crowd filled the air. "Justice for Marcus! Hold them all accountable!" Damon stopped at the courthouse steps, raising his hand to silence the crowd. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying over the sea of people. "This isn't just about me. It's about my brother, Marcus, and every single person who's ever been silenced. People who were told they didn't matter. Today proves that they do." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Damon wasn't done. "We can't stop here. The system that let this happen still exists, but today we've taken the first step in breaking it down. This is just the beginning." Langston stepped forward, guiding Damon away as the chants grew louder, the energy electric as they moved through the crowd. A familiar face appeared, Damon's mother, tears streaming down her cheeks as she wrapped him in a hug. "Marcus would be so proud," she whispered. Damon closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the day finally settling. "We did it, Mom." She pulled back, her hands on his shoulders. "No, Damon, you did it." That night, Damon sat alone on his balcony. The city stretched out beneath him, its lights flickering against the dark sky. His phone buzzed with messages, victims thanking him, people sharing their stories, news updates reporting the fallout. He glanced at a photo of Marcus on the table beside him. His brother's smile was frozen in time. For the first time in years, Damon felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but the truth had been heard. Justice had finally come. Months later, the world felt lighter. The storm had passed, leaving behind something Damon hadn't felt in years. Hope. The footage, the trial, and the fallout had sparked a reckoning that reached far beyond him. Paul Wright and Daniel Moore were serving their sentences. Their badges were gone, and their reputations were in tatters. Justice had come for them, but the fight had always been for Marcus. Damon sat in the courthouse waiting room, tapping his fingers lightly against his knee. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, illuminating the room in a calm glow. Nearby, his mother sat beside him, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, though she hadn't taken a sip. "You think he'll come out soon?" she asked quietly, glancing toward the double doors leading to the courtroom. Damon nodded, his voice steady. "They said the judge is finalizing everything. It's just a formality now." His mother's lips quivered into the smallest smile. Finally. Before Damon could respond, the doors swung open. Langston appeared first, his professional demeanor intact, but the faint smile on his face gave it all away. Then came Marcus. He stepped into the waiting room, his tall frame straight and strong, dressed sharply in clean clothes. Marcus looked different than Damon remembered, lighter somehow, as though the weight of 2 years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Their mother gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hands as tears spilled down her cheeks. Marcus crossed the room in a few strides and pulled her into a hug, holding her tight, as though making up for every second they'd lost. "I'm home, Mama," Marcus whispered. "It's over." Damon watched them for a moment, his throat tightening. He stood as Marcus turned, meeting his brother's gaze. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus smiled, a smile Damon hadn't seen in years. "You did it," Marcus said, his voice rough but full of warmth. "You actually did it." Damon stepped forward and pulled his brother into a hug, his voice quiet. "We did it. You're free." Marcus gripped Damon's shoulder tightly, his voice lowering. "They're going to fix it, right? The people they hurt?" Damon nodded. "The judge said all their cases are being reopened. People are getting second chances because of you." Marcus stepped back, shaking his head slowly as if still trying to process it all. "I don't know how you did it, man. After what they put me through, I thought they'd win forever." Damon's jaw tightened. "They almost did, but this time they lost." Later that afternoon, they stood together on the courthouse steps. The air was crisp, the sun high in the sky, and reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward. Marcus stood at the center, Damon and Langston on either side of him. Marcus cleared his throat as the cameras clicked. His voice was steady, but filled with emotion. "My name is Marcus Taylor. 2 years ago, I was wrongfully arrested and convicted because of Paul Wright and Daniel Moore. I spent 2 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit because no one believed me." He paused, glancing at Damon with a faint smile. "But my brother never gave up. Damon fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. Because of him, and because of the truth, my name is clear." Marcus's words hung in the air, filling the space with a heavy silence as the crowd absorbed every syllable. Damon stood beside his brother, his expression stoic, but his heart swelling with pride. The crowd grew quiet as Marcus continued, his voice steady and filled with emotion. "What happened to me isn't rare. There are so many people who've been silenced, ignored, and forgotten. But this proves that the truth matters. It proves that justice is possible." Damon stepped forward, adding to his brother's words. "This fight wasn't just for Marcus. It was for everyone who's been wronged, the people who were told their voices didn't matter. Paul Wright and Daniel Moore thought they were untouchable, but they were wrong. No one is above accountability." The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause deafening as reporters shouted questions. Damon and Marcus stepped back, their mother joining them, slipping an arm around both of her sons as they made their way down the courthouse steps together. The energy in the air was electric, the feeling of victory palpable. That evening, The three of them sat around the dining room table in their childhood home. The familiar scent of home-cooked food filled the air, a comfort they hadn't shared as a family in years. Marcus leaned back in his chair, laughing as their mother piled more food onto his plate. "I swear, Mama, you're trying to fatten me up," Marcus teased, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "You're too skinny, boy," she responded, brushing away a tear as she laughed. Damon watched them both, a quiet warmth settling over him. The years they'd lost couldn't be replaced, but they had this moment, and so many more to come. Suddenly, Marcus's expression shifted to something more serious. He turned to Damon, his voice lowering. "You know they'll keep fighting, right? People like Wright. They'll always try to find a way to win." Damon nodded, his gaze steady. "Let them try. They won't win this time. We know how to fight back now." Marcus held out a fist, and Damon bumped it with his own, a silent promise between brothers. Their mother smiled through her tears, shaking her head. "You boys are something else," Marcus grinned. "You raised us right, Mama." Damon leaned back in his chair, letting the sounds of laughter and clinking dishes wash over him. Outside, the world was still flawed, still fighting its battles, but for now, this moment was theirs. Marcus was free. The truth had won, and for Damon, that was enough.